What happens when God's patience reaches its limit? Today, you'll learn about the 7 most explosive episodes of his wrath, each with a powerful lesson, and the third one will change your perspective forever. The story of Adam and Eve marks the beginning of the biblical narrative about humanity, where God's wrath is revealed for the first time. It all starts in a perfect garden, Eden, where man and woman live in complete harmony with creation. There, God gives them just one command: do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. However, curiosity and the desire to be like God lead Adam and Eve to disobey. Imagine a situation where someone breaks the only rule meant for their own safety. It's like when a parent repeatedly warns their child not to touch a flame, but the child, driven by curiosity, does it anyway. What happens? A painful burn, a lesson learned the hard way. Similarly, by eating the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve not only disobeyed, but also introduced something new and devastating to the world: sin. God's reaction is not just one of disappointment, but of justice. He had already warned that disobedience would have severe consequences. When God confronts Adam and Eve, they try to hide, something that resonates with anyone who's ever tried to escape the consequences of a bad decision. But God, being all-knowing, finds them and delivers his judgment. They are expelled from paradise, a land where everything was perfect, and are now thrown into a world full of challenges, hard work, and suffering. The soil, which once produced food abundantly, now only yields crops through effort, sweat, and pain. The life they once knew is lost forever, and death, something they had never encountered, becomes an unavoidable reality. This first manifestation of God's wrath is not just a punishment, but a pivotal moment in human history. Disobedience brought chaos into what was perfect, and humanity has been marked by this flaw ever since. Eden, which could have been an eternal paradise, becomes a symbol of what was lost, and with that, the story of redemption begins. A long journey back to communion with God, which will only be completed much later in the biblical narrative. Over time, humanity multiplied and spread across the earth. However, as generations passed, sin became more and more deeply rooted in people's hearts. Evil became so intense that the scriptures describe it as every thought of man's heart was continuously evil. The world that God had created with so much love was now full of violence, corruption, and disregard for his laws. That's when God made a drastic decision. He saw that human wickedness had reached a point of no return, and the only solution was a fresh start. It's like when a farmer sees that his entire crop is infested with pests beyond saving and decides to destroy it to plant anew. But even in the face of destroying what he had created, God found an exception: Noah, a righteous and blameless man in his generation. God commanded Noah to build an ark, a massive vessel capable of housing his family and pairs of every animal species. Picture the scene. Noah, in a world where it had never rained, begins to build this gigantic ark, probably facing mockery and disbelief from everyone around him. But he obeys because he trusts in God's words. When the ark is finally completed, God instructs Noah, his family, and all the animals to enter it. Then the rain begins to fall. This isn't just any rain. It's a flood that lasts 40 days and 40 nights, covering even the peaks of the highest mountains. The water destroys everything: cities, crops, animals, and human beings. The flood wipes out all the evil that had taken over the earth, but it also brings a deep sadness. The cost of purification is total destruction. However, in the midst of this severe judgment, there is a glimmer of hope. The ark floats on the waters, protecting those who were chosen to survive. When the rain finally stops and the waters begin to recede, Noah sends out a dove to find dry land. And eventually, the dove returns with an olive branch in its beak, a sign that life is returning to the earth. When Noah and his family leave the ark, God makes a covenant with them. He places a rainbow in the sky as a symbol of his promise never to destroy the earth with a flood again. This moment is not just the end of judgment, but also the beginning of a new era, where humanity has the chance to start over. God's wrath, so devastating in the flood, also reveals a side of mercy and renewal. As time passed after the flood, the earth was repopulated. People multiplied and built cities, but the human tendency to stray from God's ways soon resurfaced. In a prosperous region, 2 cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, flourished, becoming notorious for their extreme corruption and immorality. The wickedness of these cities reached such a peak that the cries of their injustices reached the heavens, and God decided it was time to intervene. God's wrath against Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the most direct and terrifying events recorded in the Bible. But before taking action, God, in his mercy, sent two angels to investigate the cities and also to rescue Lot, the only righteous man living there. Lot, Abraham's nephew, had chosen to live in Sodom, attracted by the prosperity of the place, but he was deeply troubled by the moral decay surrounding him. The angels arrive in the city, and Lot welcomes them into his home, sensing the seriousness of the situation. But soon, the depravity of the inhabitants becomes evident. Men of the city surround Lot's house, demanding that he hand over the visitors so they can abuse them. The violence and perversion of the scene reflect the complete moral collapse in Sodom. In response, the angels reveal to Lot their mission: to completely destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. They order him and his family to leave immediately because divine judgment is imminent. Lot, desperate, tries to convince his future sons-in-law to flee as well, but they don't believe him and choose to stay in the city, a decision that will cost them their lives. As Lot's family finally escapes, they are given a clear warning. But as they flee, Lot's wife, perhaps driven by nostalgia or curiosity, disobeys. She looks back and is instantly turned into a pillar of salt, symbolizing the immediate consequence of disobedience. Then, the sky opens, and a rain of fire and sulfur falls upon Sodom and Gomorrah. The once prosperous cities are completely destroyed. There are no traces left of their wealth, buildings, or inhabitants. Everything is reduced to ashes, a severe reminder of the consequences of unchecked sin and God's wrath in the face of iniquity. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the biblical narrative moves into a new chapter in the story of God's people. Many years had passed, and the descendants of Abraham, now called the Israelites, had grown into a great nation, but were living as slaves in Egypt. The oppression was severe, and the people cried out for deliverance. That's when God called Moses to be the leader who would guide the Israelites out of captivity. However, their liberation wouldn't come easily. The Pharaoh of Egypt, a stubborn and arrogant ruler, refused to release the slaves, defying God's authority. To convince Pharaoh and demonstrate divine power, God sent a series of plagues upon Egypt, each one more devastating than the last. The first plague turned the waters of the Nile into blood, killing fish and making the water undrinkable. The river, which was the lifeline of Egypt, became a symbol of death and judgment. But Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Next, a plague of frogs invaded Egypt, filling homes, streets, and fields. Although the Egyptians revered frogs in their religion, this plague brought chaos and discomfort, exposing the futility of their gods. Yet Pharaoh still didn't give in. The plagues continued. Lice covered people and animals, flies swarmed the air, and livestock began dying from a severe disease. God was showing his control over all forces of nature, but Pharaoh remained stubborn. Then came the plagues that directly attacked the health and safety of the Egyptians. Painful boils broke out on people's bodies, followed by a hailstorm mixed with fire that destroyed crops and killed those who weren't sheltered. The surviving crops were devoured by a plague of locusts, leaving Egypt on the brink of famine. Finally, a thick darkness covered the land for 3 days, so dense it felt tangible, plunging Egypt into despair. Despite all this suffering, Pharaoh still refused to let the Israelites go. Then, God announced the final and most terrible plague, the death of the firstborns of Egypt. On that fateful night, the angel of death passed through Egypt, killing the firstborn of every family, from Pharaoh's own son to the child of the lowest servant. Only the houses of the Israelites, who followed the instruction to mark their doors with the blood of a sacrificial lamb, were spared. Grief swept through Egypt. Finally, broken by the pain of his loss, Pharaoh ordered the Israelites to leave immediately. Thus, after centuries of slavery, God's people were set free, but their freedom came at the cost of severe judgment on Egypt. Despite the continuous displays of God's power and authority, the people of Israel still struggled to keep their faith during their journey through the desert. The trials were many, and at several points, impatience and disobedience led to new manifestations of divine wrath. One of these significant episodes occurred when the Israelites, in yet another moment of spiritual weakness, gave in to temptation and worshipped an idol, provoking God's intense anger. This happened when Moses went up Mount Sinai to receive the tablets of the law, a crucial moment where God would establish the commandments to guide the people. While Moses was away, the people grew restless. They felt Moses was taking too long, and in a desperate and disobedient act, they pressured Aaron, Moses' brother, to make an idol for them to worship. Aaron gave in to the pressure and, gathering the people's gold jewelry, he molded a golden calf. This golden calf became the center of an idolatrous celebration, where the Israelites sacrificed and rejoiced, declaring that this idol was the God that had brought them out of Egypt. The scene was a deep betrayal of their commitment to God, replacing the worship of the Creator with the worship of a man-made object. Meanwhile, on the mountain, God saw what was happening in the camp and informed Moses about the rebellion. God's anger burned, and he told Moses that he would destroy the entire nation and start a new one, descended only from Moses. However, Moses interceded for the people, appealing to God's mercy and reminding him of the promises made to the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moved by Moses' plea, God reconsidered and spared the nation from complete destruction. However, when Moses descended from the mountain and saw the rampant idolatry with his own eyes, he was furious. He broke the stone tablets, symbols of the covenant, and confronted the people about the seriousness of their sin. To deal with the rebellion, Moses had the golden calf ground into powder and mixed with water, forcing the Israelites to drink it as a sign of their bitterness and shame. Then the Levites, who had not participated in the idolatry, were called to punish the leaders of the rebellion. About 3,000 men fell that day, a severe display of divine justice. But God's anger didn't stop there. As a result of their disobedience and betrayal, God sent a plague upon the people, a direct punishment that struck many, serving as a painful reminder of the consequences of unfaithfulness. The plague was a way to purify the camp and bring the people back to recognizing God's sovereignty. After many years of wandering in the desert, the Israelites finally approached the Promised Land. Under the leadership of Joshua, Moses' successor, the people were ready to take possession of the land that God had promised to their ancestors. However, the Promised Land wasn't empty. It was inhabited by various powerful and fortified nations, one of which was the city of Jericho, known for its massive walls. Jericho presented a significant challenge. Its walls were so thick and high that they seemed impenetrable. The city itself symbolized the strength and resistance of the Canaanites, and taking Jericho would be a clear sign of God's authority and the beginning of the conquest of Canaan. But instead of a conventional battle, God had a plan that would test the people's faith and obedience. God instructed Joshua to have all the warriors march around the city once a day for 6 days. Leading the army, the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant, a symbol of God's presence, and blew trumpets made of ram's horns. On the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times, and at the prolonged sound of the trumpets, the people were to shout with all their might. This plan must have seemed strange from a human perspective. Marching silently around a fortified city, day after day without raising a weapon or launching a direct attack, must have seemed like a senseless strategy to many. But Joshua and the people obeyed without question, following every detail of God's command. On the 7th day, after completing the 7th lap, the priests blew the trumpets, and the people shouted louder than they ever had before. At that moment, the walls of Jericho, which had seemed unshakable, began to crumble. They fell to the ground, allowing the Israelites to storm the city and completely conquer it. Jericho was destroyed, and all its inhabitants, except for Rahab and her family, were killed. Rahab had helped the Israelite spies earlier and had shown faith in God. The fall of Jericho was a monumental event, not just because it was the first major victory in the conquest of Canaan, but because it clearly demonstrated that the victory of God's people didn't depend on military strength or human strategies. It was obedience to God that determined success. The walls that once represented an insurmountable obstacle were brought down not by human might, but by divine power, which responds to faith and submission. This event is more than just a military victory. It's a declaration of God's power to tear down any barrier that stands against his purposes. Jericho serves as a symbol for all the walls that may rise in our lives, challenges, fears, doubts, and reminds us that with faith and obedience, No obstacle is too great to overcome. After the remarkable victory at Jericho, the Israelites continued their conquest of the Promised Land, confident in God's power to guide them. But even as they experienced success, holiness and obedience remained absolute requirements to maintain God's blessing. It was in this context that one of the most mysterious and immediate displays of God's wrath occurred, involving the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred symbol of God's presence among the people. The Ark of the Covenant was carried with the utmost reverence because it contained the tablets of the law, a portion of manna, and Aaron's staff. It was a physical manifestation of the covenant between God and Israel, and its holiness could not be violated. During one transport of the ark to Jerusalem, King David led the procession with great joy. There was music, singing, and a general atmosphere of celebration, as bringing the ark to the city was a spiritual milestone for the nation. However, something unexpected happened along the way. The ark was being transported on an ox cart, and at one point, one of the oxen stumbled, causing the ark to sway. A man named Uzzah, who was walking beside the cart, instinctively reached out to steady the ark and prevent it from falling. It was a gesture that, at first glance, seemed natural and even right, protecting the most sacred object from hitting the ground. But as soon as Uzzah touched the ark, he was struck down by God. His instant death stopped the celebration in its tracks and left everyone in shock, including David, who was deeply shaken and fearful by what had just happened. This episode serves as a powerful reminder of God's holiness and the strictness of his instructions. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't just a religious artifact, it was God's throne among his people. Touching the Ark was a direct violation of the laws given by God, which specified that only designated Levites could handle it, and only by using the poles specifically made for that purpose. Uzzah's action, though well-intentioned, ignored God's specific command and treated the sacred as something ordinary. This event shows that good intentions don't replace obedience to God's word. God's wrath in this case was a reaffirmation of the respect that must be maintained for holy things and a warning that familiarity or neglect of what is sacred can lead to severe consequences. After this incident, David decided not to proceed immediately with the ark to Jerusalem and left it at the house of Obed-Edom, where it stayed for 3 months. During this time, Obed-Edom's household was abundantly blessed, showing that when God's holiness is respected, his blessings follow. Over time, Israel settled in the Promised Land and prospered under the leadership of kings like David and his son Solomon. Under Solomon's reign, the kingdom reached its peak, marked by the construction of the Temple in Jerusalem, a grand structure meant to be the dwelling place of God among his people. Solomon's temple became the spiritual center of Israel, a place of worship where people offered sacrifices and sought God's presence. The temple was more than just a building. It was a symbol of God's covenant with Israel and his ongoing presence with the people. However, as the years passed, the nation began to drift away from faithfulness to God. After Solomon's death, Israel was divided into 2 kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Idolatry, corruption, and injustice began to spread, especially among the kings who followed. Prophets were sent to warn the people, calling them back to obedience, but their warnings were largely ignored. God's patience, which had been extended many times before, began to run out. God would not tolerate his people's betrayal forever, especially when it came to idolatry and the abuse of power that was poisoning the nation. The temple, which was supposed to be the heart of true worship, began to be defiled with pagan practices, and injustice became widespread throughout the land. The people who had been chosen to be a light to the nations were now engulfed in darkness. Eventually, God allowed the consequences of their actions to catch up with them. In 586 BC, Jerusalem was besieged by the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar. After months of resistance, the city fell, and Solomon's temple, once majestic, was destroyed. The walls were torn down, the treasures were looted, and the sacred building was set on fire, reduced to ruins. Those who survived the siege were taken into captivity in Babylon. The destruction of the temple was a devastating blow to Israel, both physically and spiritually. It wasn't just the loss of a magnificent building, it was the loss of the symbol of God's presence among them. For the Israelites, the destruction of the temple meant that God had turned away from them, that the covenant was broken because of their unfaithfulness. This event marks a crucial point in Israel's history, known as the Babylonian exile. During this time of captivity, the people deeply reflected on their sins and the reasons for their downfall. Prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel were raised up to guide and comfort the people, offering hope for redemption and restoration, but also reaffirming that the destruction of the temple was a direct consequence of their disobedience and idolatry. With the temple in ruins and the people of Israel exiled in Babylon, it seemed like all hope was lost. But even in the midst of captivity and destruction, God's promises to restore his people were never forgotten. The exile became a time of reflection and repentance, a period where the Israelites were led to recognize the seriousness of their sins and to seek God once again. However, Israel's story wouldn't end in Babylon. The biblical narrative points to a future event that transcends the history of one nation, the final judgment. The final judgment, as described in the book of Revelation and other scriptures, is the moment when God will judge all of humanity, not just Israel, but every nation and people on earth. This event is the culmination of history, where divine justice will be fully revealed, and each person will be confronted with the choices they made during their life. Unlike previous manifestations of God's wrath, which were specific and targeted, the final judgment will be universal. There will be no escape or place to hide. It is described as a moment when heaven and earth will pass away and all the dead, great and small, will stand before the throne of God. Books will be opened, including the book of life, where the names of those who are saved are recorded. Those whose lives were marked by rejecting God and doing evil will be separated from the righteous and cast into the lake of fire, symbolizing eternal condemnation. This is the final consequence of rebelling against God, a fate that cannot be reversed. On the other hand, those who remained faithful, who sought justice and walked in God's ways, will be rewarded with eternal life in the New Jerusalem, where there will be no more death, pain, or suffering. It will be a place of perpetual peace, where God's presence will be the light that illuminates everything. The final judgment is not just an event of condemnation, but also of renewal. It marks the end of evil and the complete restoration of creation, where God makes all things new. Death and sin, which entered the world through Adam and Eve's disobedience, will finally be defeated, and God's original order will be restored. The temple, destroyed by the Babylonians, is but a faint shadow compared to the glory of the New Jerusalem, where God himself will dwell with his people. This ultimate act of divine justice puts all previous manifestations of God's wrath in history into perspective. Each one, from Adam's fall to the destruction of Sodom, the flood, and the fall of Jerusalem, was a foreshadowing of the final judgment. They were reminders that God is holy and just and that his laws cannot be ignored without consequences. The final judgment is the conclusion of history, where everything will be revealed and set right. It affirms that in the end, God's justice will prevail and his mercy, extended to those who repent and believe, will triumph over sin and death. It is the inevitable conclusion of a divine plan that began with creation and culminates in the complete redemption of all that was lost. If you enjoyed this journey through some of the Bible's most impactful stories, where we saw the powerful manifestations of divine justice, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Here we always dive into deep topics and bring reflections that can change the way you see the world and your faith. Like the video if it brought you new insights, and share your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing what you have to say. Every like, comment, and subscription helps us keep bringing content that feeds the mind and spirit. See you next time.